Thank you. Just 1 second, I'll share my screen. Thank you for the opportunity. And my paper begins with almost all of those who have ever read the Bible have encountered at least one prophetic text full of violent images. In most cases, these images are to be found in the prophets who use them to violently ridicule behaviors or opinions. This grotesque rhetoric immersed in abject images related to whoredom, drunkenness, vomiting, and excrements is a challenge to most of us. Contemporary readers of Malachi 2 to 3, for example, note that the intensity of the prophetic rhetoric underscores and intensifies the authoritarian, harsh dimensions of the image of God the Father. The book of Malachi does not argue in favor of, but trusts that the reader shares the assumption that sons should honor their fathers. Israel owes God the Father honor and respect, inherits land from God his Father, and is subject to being punished and shamed by his Father. Another challenge is the metaphorical language of sexual violence against women. For example, in the prophetic depictions of the punishment that God the warrior will exact, the one who receives punishment is usually described in feminine terms. In other cases, the prophetic violent rhetoric against women is set within a domestic context, such as in Ezekiel 16 and 23. In the book Challenging Prophetic Metaphor, Judah O'Brien observes that readers respond to these absolutely violent images by taking one of two opposite extremes, loving it or hating it. According to her, neither of these polarized positions helps readers decide what to do with texts like this. Any interpretation that fails to take the violence and the misogyny of their rhetoric into serious account equally fails to consider the problems that most modern day readers have appreciating them. In the same way, the hate it strategy gives readers a false confidence that the problems they may have with these images remain the text universe and can be solved by a simple refusal to read or approve of the book as a whole. This either or strategy does not solve one dilemma, though. Readers might either appreciate or critique biblical texts, but not to do both. So, as part of the traditional hermeneutical approaches session, I propose that recognizing the satirical tone of these images helps us both appreciate and critique them. I've chosen to narrow the scope of my inquiry to the violent images of Ezekiel 16 and 23, and my argument will proceed in two stages. First, I will briefly examine the nomenclature extended metaphors used to describe these metaphors, and second, I will seek to examine how these extended metaphors of Ezekiel are developed throughout the text. This referred development of the metaphors will be observed through, first, the assumption of the address's point of view, and second, the presence of an intensified reversal. So, the extended satirical metaphor. The detailed metaphorical descriptions in Ezekiel 16 and 23 are somewhat extensive. According to Wayne Booth, good weapon metaphors are concise. Metaphors are usually known for their brevity. One says more with less. The more you convey in a given number of words, the better. When a metaphor is more extensive, it risks having the reader forget what is being talked about. Dwelling on this definition of metaphor, McKeating writes, Ezekiel, by his complexity, loses directness and blunts the cutting edge of his imagery. Although some scholars argue that Ezekiel's metaphors are allegories, others emphasize the distinction between allegory and what is called an extended metaphor. Gallenbusch draws on Fry to argue that while the book might display allegorizing tendencies, its metaphorical language cannot straightforwardly be understood as an allegory per se. To declare Ezekiel's language allegorical, the reader must therefore redefine allegory as far as to turn the term misleading, if not purposeless. Consequently, this discussion is useful both for the rejection of a notoriously deceptive term and for arguing that Ezekiel's distinctive language is metaphorical. The language Ezekiel uses to confront us is not as neat or accessible as we might expect from a full-blown allegory. Instead, as Gallenbusch observes, Ezekiel's extended metaphors have the complexity and indeterminacy generally understood to characterize metaphor. Allegories seems to surface in critical atmospheres when, for political or metaphysical reasons, there is something that cannot be said. Hence, the allegory is one way to recast ideas, events, premises, and a way that enables writers to make a point which would not be possible to be made directly given a political or social environment. But the sexual metaphors of Ezekiel do not seem just to scratch polemical atmospheres. Since they are in regard of a specific target, these metaphors touch a sore spot of the audience. There is an object of attack. In fact, this is an important question concerning one of the main distinctions between chapter 16 and 23 of Ezekiel. While chapter 16 focuses only on Jerusalem, chapter 23 converges its attention to both Jerusalem and Samaria. As targets of the prophetic utterances, Jerusalem and Samaria are criticized for their immoral conduct. This kind of direct criticism is the most prominent attribute of a satire. Even though the term satire often refers to the literary genre of an entire work, it fits less comfortably under the heading of irony. Northrop Frye defines it as a militant irony. According to him, two things are essential to a satire. One is wit or humor founded on fantasy or a sense of the grotesque or absurd. The other is an object of attack. Attack without humor or pure denunciation forms the boundaries of a satire. Whereas in other contexts, the use of irony doesn't presume the narrator's moral judgment. The militant irony of the prophet is grim and macabre. The text exhibits the laughter of an attack, a kind of laughter that characterizes a satire. The prophet satirist does not simply tell us a story about the wrongdoers. Usually, the words are addressed to the wrongdoers themselves. Moreover, while addressing the wicked, the prophet often makes use of the addressee's point of view, either explicitly through a direct quote of the addressee's speech or thoughts, or more subtly in an implicit manner. David Fishelov writes, and I'm quoting him, the prophet might use one of three major options: to adopt in an ironical manner the value system of the sinners, exhorting them to go on with their wicked behavior, to pretend to adopt their worldview, providing a long list of the materialistic items that preoccupy their mind, the catalog, as he says, or to use certain images that belong to the sinner's way of thinking. So, the question of point of view. As one of satire's devices, invective requires literary talent and artistry in order to be successful a talent specifically described by Fry as including a sense of rhythm, an unlimited vocabulary, and a technical knowledge of the two subjects which ordinarily form the one's content of swearing. The first is theology, the other is by referring to anatomy or physiology matters using sexual and experimental imageries.
Lucas,
the sexual and yes,
Lucas, really quick. I don't think that we're seeing the screen that you're seeing. Our
really?
screen is blank.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I heard what sounded like a noise of a slide advancing and wanted to make sure that we got to see that.
I'll try to share again. Sorry for that. I don't know what happened. How is it now? It's okay. I will leave like this. Okay. So the sexual and metaphorical language of Ezekiel is the most extreme and offensive of the Hebrew Bible. Ezekiel's metaphors are more offensive than those found in Hosea and Jeremiah. Sexually explicit phrases proliferate throughout these chapters. In Ezekiel 16, verses 25 and 26, for example, we hear God accusing Jerusalem of whoring in details such as you spread your legs for every passerby and multiplied your whorings, and you played the whore with the Egyptians, your big-membered neighbors. Furthermore, Ezekiel 23, verses 20 and 21 says, and she was hot for their consorts, whose flesh was the flesh of donkeys and whose members were like the members of stallions. Strong reactions to these images can be observed within the realm of biblical scholars. According to Van Dyck Hammer, Ezekiel 16 and 23 should be exposed as pornography. Dar insists that Ralph Klein is simply incorrect when, in his recent book, he remarks that Ezekiel's indictment proves almost to be vulgar. It is vulgar. Greenberg argues about Ezekiel 16 in these words. Alongside the climatic structure, lurid images and shocking language serve to sustain this long, verbose diatribe. Fornicating with male images, slaughtering children for them to eat, spreading legs for every passerby. Your juice was poured out, a bloody object of fury and passion, and hack you with their swords. The sense of the grotesque or absurd is developed in the satirical metaphors of Ezekiel as a way to adopt the target's point of view. The shocking images that belong to the transgressor's way of thinking create laughing stocks of wrongdoing. These descriptions attack language itself and the forms of language because they shelter the customary and the complacent. The satirical metaphors are filled with the grotesque and the absurd because these are the images and correlatives of their judgment. They are external signs of an inward disgrace, using the grotesque to point towards their reprehensible behavior, the absence of any principle of identity, humanity, unity, coherence, or purpose that could give attractive moral form to such unspeakable acts. The grotesque often distorts rhetorical forms in which the satirist's speech becomes the verbal counterpart of grotesque behavior. Satirical metaphors jumble form and content because the word they indict is a moral jumble. As Robert Alter says, if the speaker sarcastically invokes the viewpoint of his human objects of reproof, conjuring up the illusory pleasures of or power to which they are addicted, he produced a satirical depiction of how the evil are self-deceived. Tonally, the satire tends to jeer where the accusations angrily expose and impugn. Substantially, they tend to be evocations of the moral psychology of overweening wickedness. Besides this subtle and indirect manner of using the addressee's point of view, the metaphors of Ezekiel explicitly quote the addressee's speech and thoughts, The access to the thoughts is clear in Ezekiel 16. The text points out that Jerusalem trusted in her beauty. She played the whore with the Egyptians to vex God, and she was insatiable. The same phenomenon occurs in Ezekiel 23. As read above, Ezekiel 23 describes the reasons why Oholibah is hot for her consorts. Finally, both chapters describe that they acted in this manner because they forgot God, and explicit inner information about the targets of the accusations. On the semantic level, the prophet organizes a satirical attack according to a narrative principle consisted in an intensified reversal. The satirical metaphor tells us a small story. Within this story, one basic structure is reiterated in many variations. The movement of the sinners, either referring to a sector of the people of Israel, to the whole people of Israel or Judah, to the king, or to a foreign nation or king, from a state of success to a state of failure. Turning something big into something small is a simple reversal, while turning something small into something much smaller is an intensification. Thus, turning something big into something very small would be an intensified reversal. The move from phase A of the story to phase B of the fall and punishment is a move from a state of sinful success to a colossal fall, a fall described in sharp and intensified manner. The narrative principle of intensified reversal can be expressed in many ways. Sometimes a large textual segment will be dedicated to the description of the success, or there may be a dynamic movement between the pole of success and that of failure. After describing the origins of Jerusalem and her covenant with God, Ezekiel 16 describes increasingly heinous offenses through the key root zana, that means to harlot, to fornicate, which occurs also counting its derivative form 20 times. Jerusalem's situation goes from bad to worse. Fornication with idols was too little, so she killed her children for them. Idols too were not enough, so she extended her harlotry to male neighbors without ever finding satisfaction. Her nadir of degradation on paying her lovers is dwelt upon in several antithetical sentences. Finally, in verse 35 begins the intensified reversal. The verdict on her conduct is an outpouring of accumulated rage, heaping up items of indictment that bring punishment in the same measure of her wrongdoings. Ezekiel 23 opens with a description of these two sisters, which is then followed by a description of their adulthood. And in the end, it can be noted that we have here another manifestation of the mini story with an intensified reversal expressed in the description of punishment awaiting the sinners, the sisters. And by addressing the sinners, making an indirect use of their point of view, which is echoed in this catalog list of the lovers and their titles and decorations. Concluding, by employing the grotesque and absurd images, Ezekiel creates satirical metaphors that impact readers. The tendency of graphically intensifying various aspects of the scene instead of simply referring to the scenes heightens the satirical effect of the text. Behind the great variety of individual temperaments, one can detect a number of organizing principles shared by a large segment of the satirical metaphors of the prophets. All these microstructuring principles of biblical poetry, as well as the macro structure of a coherent and reversed narrative, play an important part in making Ezekiel's satirical metaphor so effective. Satirical metaphors arise in situations of conflict or crisis, when there is a need for a response that could hinder or reverse crisis, or when the traditional or usual way of looking at things no longer seems to be working. While on one hand, it is comprehensible that the graphic detailed descriptions is not fortuitous, on the other hand, the chosen metaphors that reinforces the target's posture evoke shared assumptions. Ezekiel 16 and 23 confront current readers with their disturbing premises that, for example, female sexuality is inherently defiant. After being violently criticized for her illicit sexual conduct, Jerusalem never opens her mouth again. She is silenced. In his study, The Muse of Pain, an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot and Satirical Reprisal, David Morris observes, and I quote him, satire constitutes a form of literary discourse uniquely concerned with power and with directing that power against the foolish, corrupt, greedy, stupid, and dangerous, the recurring targets of prophetic power. Despite its literary artfulness as a weapon, the satire ignores dialogue. There are no voices to be heard, only hearers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucas. I trust that with a paper taking up Ezekiel 16 and 23, we will have no shortage of discussion ensuing in the final portion of our time together. But thank you again for bringing that hermeneutical lens to those texts. Our next paper